All right, welcome to Let's Accelerate. My name is Michael Nichols. I am here with Uwe Kirschner. We are from Bosch Innovation Consulting, which has something to do with business model innovation, trying to drive business model innovation at scale inside of a major global corporate. And today we have a guest who probably doesn't need very much introduction when it comes to business modeling, considered by probably a lot of people the godfather, the pope of business modeling and business model innovation. So we would like to extend a warm welcome to Alexander Osterwalder.
Thanks for having me.
Alex, it's our pleasure having you today. So let's start. You recently published a book, The Invincible Company. What do you know about innovation today? What you know when you've published your first book, The Business Model Generation?
We know a lot more because I think the whole domain evolved a lot, right? So when we started out, we actually focused on startups. And I say we because it came out of a doctoral dissertation with my co-author, Yves Pigneur. And, we were really thinking about business models and teams that have to shape their business models and value propositions. When you do this in a corporation, you actually do the same tasks as a startup. You could call it corporate venture. But there are additional constraints around you that you need to be able to manage as a team, but then also as an organization to enable the team. So what I've learned over the last 10 years since we published the first book, now we're at 5, is how hard it is actually to do corporate innovation or corporate startups. But we now know most of how it works. So it's, I believe, today a commitment challenge more than kind of a technical challenge. I think innovation is not a black box anymore. And we know this now. We even know how to measure the reduction of risk and uncertainties. So over the last 10 years, it was a crazy learning journey, watching what works and what doesn't, a lot of what doesn't work. And I believe the whole innovation landscape has become a lot more professional. It's almost like, we started out, last little comment, we started out, trying to do innovation surgery without really knowing the anatomy and physiology books and without having the internships. And now I think innovation is becoming a real profession because innovation is different from managing. It's not that one is better or more important. You need both, right? But they're different. And innovation is truly becoming a profession today, and it's not a black box anymore. So it's a super exciting time, I think.
And I think you can see, at least we've kind of grown with you. I think we started with the business model canvas, right? And a lot of times the business model canvas in a corporate is just treated as a check mark, right? We filled out the canvas, we're done, right? Here comes the innovation. But it turns out, I think you realized the same thing. You went into the value proposition canvas because often what's missing is that deep customer problem that you're solving. But then just in your last comment, you were talking about, but you're doing this also inside of a corporate environment. And your last book and many of the conversations we've had with you have to do with ambidexterity. So maybe for the audience, could you explain this corporate context and what ambidexterity means to you?
So maybe just the first aspect around tools, right? We started out with a business model canvas. It's spread around the world. It's pretty amazing to watch. We could never expect that you'd find this tool in corporate innovation labs, startup accelerators around the globe. So literally millions of people use it. But here's the thing. It's not one tool that is going to bring success. It's as if you'd say, oh, hey, dear surgeon, here's a Swiss Army knife, and now go ahead and do heart surgery. No, it's something you need to learn. You need to practice. There's several tools or processes, right? Now, we don't need to overcomplicate it, but we do need to learn how to do this. And again, in a corporate context, there are even more tools that we need to master, and there are even more processes that we need to take into account. And that means, this ambidexterity, being world-class at managing the existing, and I think a lot of companies are really good at that, but at the same time, in parallel, not replace the other culture, in parallel, build a world-class innovation culture. Again, it's not that one is more important than the other. They need to coexist in harmony. And that sounds trivial, but it's a challenge because they're fundamentally different. One is about streamlining what you already, have proven. You need to manage your business models, make them better, and almost to a certain extent, kill anything that looks different, right? Antibodies. Right. So as an organization, you develop these antibodies. So the challenge is, how do you create an exploration culture where you're actually capable to invent the future while you're managing the existing? So startup doesn't have that challenge, right? But as an established corporation, you have that challenge. And traditionally established companies, they did acquisitions, and everything else kind of looked like a black box. Now, acquisitions are still a really good tool, but it's one among many, which is exploration, investing in outside ventures, investing in your inside teams, almost like it was a venture. So there are many things in addition, new tools, processes that we need to establish. And what a leadership team needs to do in this context is enable the best teams and projects to emerge, right? That's different from managing, where the leadership team actually, makes the key decisions, kind of top down to a certain extent, even with a certain decentralization, of course. In innovation, the leadership's responsibility is completely different. So ideas come completely bottom up, but they can't survive if top down you haven't created that second culture, the culture of exploration. So you need to put both in place. And that's the role of leadership, not to pick the winning ideas.
Right, and it all sounds so easy, right? In theory, you can put exploit or core, you can put beyond and explore up here, nice boxes. But we know it's very difficult, just as M&A is also very difficult, fails most of the time. And you can only count maybe a few of them that were successful. And it's the same maybe with ambidexterity. So to prevent this spinning into, it's all good in theory, but in practice, this will never work, Alex. What are the 3 steps that you would recommend to get started, to implement ambidexterity? Is step 1 restructuring? Because this is, I think, the first thing that scares them. Oh my God, I have to reorganize my company.
And that's kind of the danger, right? When we say innovation, even when we say business model innovation, everybody thinks we need to throw away the things that we have and everything needs to radically change. And that's not the point, right? So, if you're an established company, you build something that's really good, but you have to be careful that you don't get, too comfortable or too arrogant. It happens all the time because the world is moving fast. So we need to, do a couple of things to make this work. And the first one, I think, is very simple, and I wouldn't call it restructuring. I'd give it a slightly different twist, which is giving innovation power. So making it an equal partner to execution and management. And the way you do that, and again, there's no one right model, but I'll just kind of push here. It's, there are 2 big kind of families of ways of doing this. One is the leadership, the CEO, the board, spends a substantial amount of time on breakthrough innovation, not just improving. That's good, that's important. So don't get me wrong, that is core to running a business. But at the same time, inventing the future, right? So I like to say it needs to be 40 to 60% of the time. One of my favorite examples is Bracken Darrell from Logitech. He spends 40 to 60% of his time on innovation. Or take the last 4 leadership meetings, how much time was spent on the topic of innovation. That's one kind of way of doing it. The other way of doing it, and I'll give an example here, is I like the example of Ping An, the Chinese banking and insurance conglomerate, quite a bit, because in that case, they took a radically different approach. Peter Ma, the founder, CEO, and chairman, said, I'm going to give innovation power. I'm going to hire a co-CEO with Jessica Tan, who is fully dedicated to inventing the future, as an equal partner at the leadership level, and then they report to the board. Of course, Peter Ma as a founder had these powers to do that, but it was very visionary because he said, no, we're a banking and insurance conglomerate. We're going to get killed by internet companies like Alibaba, Amazon, Tencent, and so on. So they were proactive in saying we need to change fundamentally. So it's a leadership commitment, giving innovation power. So for me, that's the first step. And then we might say, oh, that's restructuring. I don't think it's restructuring because you don't need to throw overboard the good things you have in execution. But what you need to realize is that most companies are already doing good innovation work at the team level, the innovation level, but it doesn't have sufficient power to break through. So I would almost stick with one rather than going with the top 3 steps, because once you put that in place, that power of innovation, a lot of things get unlocked. And, then you start building, right? Maybe a second one, which comes with the first one, is why don't we tear down the walls that are holding innovators and companies back? Rather than already thinking about, incentives to get more people to innovate, I think we just need to tear down the blockers, the walls that are preventing them from doing so. So we need to give small amounts of money to a large amount of teams, and then very quickly, and I think Bosch is already really good at this, retiring those projects that don't show enough evidence that they're on the right track. Not calling them failures, but, weeding them out. And what happens is over time, the best teams and projects emerge. That's what we need to kind of do, is break down the walls, invest a little bit more like venture capitalists. I'm not talking corporate venture capital, investing in your internal teams, because innovation talent and ideas, that's the easy part. I think every company has that. And at the size of Bosch, you definitely have innovation talent and teams.
It's funny you say that, because we totally agree. We think that inside of everyone, every employee, there is this potential to do entrepreneurship. There's a competing view that basically says, it's a mythology, I believe, you have to have a certain characteristics. You have to have the entrepreneurial type, which for me, that's a very depressing view of humanity. I think the more liberating one is we have to place lots of bets. And part of the game then is, once you recognize it's a failure, get off the horse, place a new bet.
So that's true, but let me just add one piece to that. So when we say innovation, we're kind of using the wrong word, I think. There are different types of innovation. And I like to draw on the giants like Clayton Christensen. You kind of can talk about three categories. Efficiency innovation, making existing things better, process, etc. Everybody can do that, and everybody should think about how to make things better. But then you have sustaining innovation, maybe new products and value propositions for your same business model. That's already a little bit harder, because you sometimes need to think outside of the management box. And then you have kind of the more transformative breakthrough innovation, where you're inventing business models of the future. I don't think everybody should be thinking about that, and I don't think everybody's good at that. So the analogy I like to use when it comes to kind of innovation is, think of tennis. Who's the world's best tennis player? Roger Federer, right? Of course, right? As a Swiss, a little bit of nationalism. But so not everybody is going to become a Roger Federer. But definitely you don't become a Roger Federer or Rafa Nadal, whoever you want to pick, right? If you don't start to practice and figure out how good you are. But you'll see through these small bets which teams and ideas and leaders have it in them to become great innovators. So I actually do think not everybody is a great innovator. Not everybody should be a great innovator. Correct. But you have the practice, right? If you start putting in place the whole system to allow the great innovators to emerge, then you will see at the size of Bosch, for example, you do have real innovation talent. But again, I wouldn't say everybody, should or can, because it's not everybody. Some people are really much better and more comfortable in managing, and that's fine, right? So we kind of we put the entrepreneur on the top cover of magazines, but I think it's just two different professions, and we need to figure out what we're better at. And as a corporation, you need to manage the talent and put the right people in the right place. So that's the way I would see innovation. Everybody might be, but not everybody should be or can be.
I mean, take Uwe. Uwe plays tennis. So what could have happened that you could have become Rafa or Roger?
Maybe I should have started earlier. Coming back to the ambidextrous topic again, Alex, looking at so many organizations, and you are in contact with so many organizations around the globe, what prevents organizations to be really successful in that?
So, it's kind of easy for me to say certain things. I'm not managing a multi-billion-dollar company, but we're working with a lot of them, and we see the constraints. So, of course, the challenge is, as a leadership team, it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier to kind of manage the existing. The leap is not as big. And when you're under pressure, let's say your company under pressure from the stock market or from activist shareholders, or even from your board, right? As a CEO, you have a certain kind of lifespan. It's really hard. So it does take a personal commitment of the senior leadership team, of the CEO, and of the board to make that jump, but it can be done. So short kind of anecdote and then an example. I remember talking to one of my CEO friends who's managing one of the biggest construction companies in Europe. And I was asking, you understand how innovation works, but it doesn't seem like you made that, jump in doing it fully, right? He said, well, mergers and acquisitions was a lot easier because the stock market would understand it. And I had a checklist, could hire the lawyers, and we could get it done. And I didn't even have to succeed with all of them because there was kind of a ratio. Innovation was still much more of a black box, right? So it was harder to kind of invest in innovation. And again, you take, as a senior leader, as a CEO, you take a pretty, substantial amount of risk exploring that because it is different from managing the existing. And most leaders, they were not hired to explore, right? So it's also very different from the skill set and the knowledge that they have. So we're at this turning point where we need to figure out, how do we invest in entrepreneurial leaders, Bracken-Darrell model, where it's the leader is able to manage this ambidexterity, or you take kind of the Ping An, Peter Ma model, where he invested in a co-CEO like Jessica Tan. And again, there's no right and wrong. You need to figure out, how do you unleash innovation? And I do think the pressure for leadership is real, but it can be done. So take Unilever as an example, where Paul Polman, when he took over as a CEO, he made a substantial commitment to sustainability in the long term, and his vision was that sustainability is good for business, but you need to think long term. So the first thing he did is abolish quarterly results, reporting of quarterly results. Think of that, right? That is pretty substantial as a first move, but it was the education of investors saying, if you want to invest with us, be in it for the long term, because we're going to transform the company in a very substantial way, investing in the long term, investing in sustainability in harmony with making more profits. Because if we do that, we will generate the profit. So, this pressure, this short-term pressure does exist. It's real, but there are now numerous examples where you see leadership teams, CEOs actually going towards that long-term commitment. Of course, Jeff Bezos always comes to mind when people talk about quarterly results. He likes to say, thank you for liking our quarterly results. We made them 5 years ago, right? But Jeff Bezos is an easy example that doesn't really work for most companies because he has the power, right, to run, the whole organization. So that's why I like Paul Polman in Unilever, because he was not the majority shareholder. He was not the person who had all that power per se, but he convinced the market of this long term. So I do think we're in this shift where we all talk about long term, but if you look at the metrics inside of organizations, they're not all focused on that long term kind of transformative innovation. In addition to managing existing, you always need those short, medium term results, but the problem is that they dominate at the expense of the longer term transformation. So that's the challenge you have as a leadership team. But I believe there are now numerous examples, still the minority, where we can show how this long-term commitment and a commitment to building an innovation ecosystem, how this can really work. But it's a difficult phase, right? A lot of leadership teams are facing this. And I talk to CEOs, it is challenging. And I always make clear, it's easy for me to say, but I refer to those examples that have really worked, right? So it is possible. It's not just theory.
That's interesting, because I often say, to find a leader like that is rare, because they almost have to be schizophrenic, right? You go to the core, drive this business, and it's totally correct to do that, right? Where's the EBIT? Where's the revenue? But on the other side, go over to your explorers, who are also maybe rarities, the ones that like it, and say, what have you learned today? And then the results might not appear. Like you said, Jeff Bezos laid the foundation 5 years before, right? So it's really, you can imagine why that's so difficult for somebody who grew up in a core business where the results are yesterday, right? And if you met them or you don't move up. So since we're talking about metrics, one of the interesting questions I think that we would have for you is, it takes a long time for the effects of doing ambidexterity to show up. So you, Alex Osterwalder, when you're out there interacting with these CEOs of these major corporations, how do you measure your impact?
I think it'd be arrogant if I tried to measure my impact because there's so many factors, right? So it's not some kind of, outside thinker that can transform a company per se. It's the leadership team. But what the question I often get, just thinking of a financial institution that I talked to, before the pandemic, we were physically meeting in Paris, one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. And the CEO was asking, well, how long does it really take to kind of get results, right? If you start this ambidextrous journey. And then the answer is, well, it depends on leadership commitment. Always admitting how hard it is to make that commitment, leadership and board. So I think it's the responsibility of the board to really create that, space where leadership can invest substantially in innovation. But then, giving an example like Ping An, which is, a really good one because they went through a transformation, and it was not an internet company before. It was a financial institution, right? Conglomerate doing banking and insurance. And within less than a decade, they went from the top 400 companies in the world to the top 10 companies in the world, depending on how you measure this. Think of it, right? In less than a decade. And why did that happen is because they gave innovation power and money, but money is, I think, the smaller problem than power. And they put in place this system for, experimentation. So actually, one of the first things that Peter Ma said to Jessica Tan when he hired her is, Jessica, you're not going to succeed right away. You're going to fail. Wow, what a great way to start your job. Your boss tells you you're going to fail. But what he meant was, you will figure it out through experimentation. And that's how innovation works. It's actually the contrary of managing, where failure is not an option. You can't have your supply chain down, for a day or for a week. So it's a different kind of culture. Again, not a better culture. It's a different culture. It needs to live under the same roof. And that's what we need to enable. That's what we need to invest in. So in less than a decade, you can actually pull off this kind of transformative innovation. Now you say, oh, that's crazy, less than a decade. So you always need to make sure you're working on short-term and long-term results in parallel. That's why we call it, also the business model portfolio approach, where you're looking at all these factors. So you can't just invest in 10 years. You're going to be dead as a CEO because your board does expect 1 year, 2 year, 3 year results. But that's why you need an entire portfolio that you constantly manage, not just an exploitation portfolio where you kind of, plug the holes through acquisitions, but a whole exploration portfolio where you're investing in many, many projects. We use Bosch as a good example of starting to put that in place, because that is different from the execution world where it's not about experimentation. Yes, agile, sure, but not about, experimenting, failing, iterating at the same scale as we do in exploration. So it can be done. And what, you're talking about our contribution, Strategyzer, myself as a thinker, we just try to make these things practical. So a lot of authors have been talking about ambidexterity for a long time. And I think now it is a question of putting those tools and processes and KPIs in place and having that leadership commitment. So our contribution is trying to make those tools and processes as simple and as practical as possible to get us to move.
Or as our boss Uwe likes to say, no longer besser Wisser, besser Macher. Yeah. So stop theorizing, do it. Yeah.
Exactly. I think innovation today is more of a commitment challenge than, we need to stop reinventing the wheel. I see it a little bit, like, software as a service. There's this phase where, corporations were doing software internally and everybody built their own software. Then came software as a service, through Salesforce, and Mark Benioff kind of took off. And they were actually, building software and managing it all the time for hundreds, thousands, then millions of companies. Guess what? There's no chance an internal team is going to be better at making that kind of software. So in our case, with Strategyzer and myself as a thinker, we tried to make those tools and processes But we do that across hundreds, thousands of companies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're better at tools and process. I can arrogantly say that because we've worked with so many companies, we failed so much that we now know how to do it. And of course, we collaborate with companies. I mean, I remember the metrics project that Bosch was involved in. So we tried to collaborate with and make that happen. But we have our specialty, that is innovation, helping companies do this at scale. So that's why I think we're at this interesting point where less and less companies are going to try to build these processes by themselves because they're not necessarily experts in the process. They're experts, content matter experts. There's no way any consultant is ever going to replace that. So, we become more facilitators, helping the teams and the companies to break through with the best tools and processes and metrics that we figured out of our whole portfolio of companies, of customers.
Well, I would say ideal transition to my last question here. How will the BMI topic evolve over time? Looking at all that, and all the history you've seen, all these fantastic books you've wrote over time. So what's next?
So, I think talking a lot with my friend and colleague Steve Blank, who launched the whole, lean startup and testing movement, innovation, this type of kind of breakthrough business model innovation or disruption used to be more of an ankle biter. So as a large corporation, as a conglomerate, you could easily kind of say, oh, we have time. The problem today is, for the challenge, I'd say, for established companies is that outside startups are better incentivized and better financed to create the business models of the future, because their only goal when they're venture backed is to actually build a profitable and scalable business. And there was some, kind of, I'd say, not so good kind of evolutions of that, but kind of we're back on track. So startups have one goal: building a scalable and profitable business model in a new space, some of them with disruptive business models, and that's their only goal. And they're insanely well financed, to a certain extent over-financed, which led to bad behaviors. They were back on track after seeing some of those bad behaviors. If you take corporate teams, and I'm not talking R&D here. R&D has always been financed very well, also been under pressure. But if we take corporate innovation, they're often less well financed, and their incentives, are not necessarily just we're going to build, the next breakthrough business model, because they're under pressure from business units. There's sometimes cannibalization, or when there's synergies, all that. How does that fit our portfolio? We'd have to create a new P&L. So that piece today is becoming more and more we need to actually embrace this transformative innovation. Otherwise, we'll get killed by these outside disruptors. So what happened, in the technology industry, if we take consumer technology, I think is happening everywhere in every single sector. And we're seeing that. Our clients, we already we thought, okay, it's kind of weird that this didn't happen faster, like the pharmaceutical industry or the food industry. They're so under pressure now because their traditional business models expired that they have to rethink. But here's the good news, and this is the fun news. I think corporations are extremely well equipped if they kind of build that system to innovate, because you have access to intellectual property, you have access to brand, you have something startups don't have, customers, right? But funny enough, corporate innovation teams don't always have access to customers because sales accounts managers are going to say, no, stay away from them, don't talk about new products, that's going to kill my bonus. So you have real things there. But once corporations figure it out, once corporations build that system, then they're really going to be well equipped. I wouldn't say it's going to be either startups or corporations, but today I'd say startups have, with the money that's available and the incentives, they're pretty dangerous these days. Now, that's why it's not a nice to have anymore to think about transformative innovation. I think actually the risk of doing nothing today is much bigger than investing in innovation. Innovation is not that risky if you understand how it works. It's not R&D, but you have to do it. So this is now a must-have, and I'm excited to see a lot of companies moving much, much faster than ever before because the threat is real. And I think it's also, we want to create more stable workplaces. I think if we don't do that, some corporations are going to go out of business. This is a reality, right? Some corporations who don't get their act together are going to suffer because they're disrupted. You might say, oh, that's the natural course of things, but it shouldn't be, because we need to, make sure that we can reinvest in the talent we have in organizations and not just say, oh, we're going to fire 20,000 people. That's not an option. We need to reinvent so we can continue to employ and continue to grow.
So we're coming towards our end of our podcast today, and we usually finish off with the so-called sentence completion exercise. So Alex, let's give it a try, okay? The next truly ambidextrous organization will be
a surprise. We do not know where it's going to come from. Yeah. It could be in any industry. It could be any kind of company. I think it's leadership commitment. So it's going to be a surprise. When we started looking at Ping An, it was a surprise how much they've done. And not that many companies or not that many leaders really deeply understand how Ping An has worked. So that is exciting because we can learn from them, even in a completely different industry.
Right.
The title of my next book will be?
I think we have a couple of books under our belt. We're focusing on scaling our company Strategyzer at the moment. We'll see. We'll see.
It's why I stopped writing books, right?
Yeah. The biggest innovation which comes out of the pandemic will be?
I think ambidextrous organizations. I think the disruption was so real for everybody that people realize it can happen. It can happen to me. Before it was kind of easy to lean back. Disruption was theoretical. I believe now this was a wake-up call, and I'm pretty optimistic that more companies are going to invest in transformative innovation because of the pandemic. So I wouldn't single out a single case or single innovation. I think it was a real disruption for all of us on many different scales, and I'm excited to see that not that many innovation budgets were cut back. We actually saw quite the contrary with a lot of our clients. That this was a moment where people really understood innovation is real. We need to invest in it, and they didn't just cut back on budgets.
So innovation itself is the innovation.
Did we forget to ask you an important question, Alex?
I think there's so many questions in innovation. I think that the one I'm excited about is why innovate? Why innovate, right? Because you could say, well, we need to innovate to grow, but why grow? So for us at Strategyzer, for myself, was also a question: why help established companies continue to innovate and grow? And it's a little bit what I said before. We can create better workplaces when innovation tools are put in place. We can unleash talent, and ultimately, it helps create value on 4 levels. And this is what I'm really excited about. It creates value for customers, number one, right? If large established companies can better innovate like startups, we'll create more value for customers. Number two, we'll create value for our business. So that does mean continuous growth. But it also means that, instead of firing people because our business model is obsolete, we can transform and continue to be a great workplace where we have stable kind of, job and security. Job security is a real thing. I don't think we can just say, just let the startups do it. It's the natural, course of things. Let's be realistic. It's not good to have to fire thousands, 10,000s, 100,000 of people. That's a very terrible form of capitalism. So I think innovation to create great workplaces is a big one, right? That leads me to the third one, great workplaces. I think that's part of the job of innovation, not just to create value for customers and the company, but also for the employees. And the last one, what I'm really excited about, and we talked about it with with Paul Polman and Unilever, creating value for society. I do believe, as corporations, we have an important role to play, because if we create a great workplace and have happy employees, we do actually have a substantial impact on companies. So the bigger the corporation, the more employees you have, the more power you have to make the world a better place. Sounds cheesy, but it's not, because coming from that, you'll also have very concrete, tangible results in terms of customer value, company value. So I do believe corporations can be a force for good, and leaders like Mark Benioff of Salesforce actually do kind of live that. And I think we should push that more, because impact is not at the expense of profit. They can be in harmony.
Right. So it's trying to making creative destruction less destructive at the end of the day, right? Socially responsible capitalism. Innovate so that we're more socially responsible. That's a nice message, I think, to end on. Uwe.
Exactly. I was about to say that. What wonderful closing remarks from you. Alex, it has been a pleasure having you on our podcast, Let's Accelerate. Thanks a lot for your time. And stay tuned.
Keep up the great work. So it's fun watching you guys continue to innovate. So congratulations.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Bye.